Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Connor Slim.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
About 8 years ago, we started this battle with Voice of the Martyrs, where we exposed the fact that they knew that there was where many girls were being raped at the orphanage. They continued to fund the orphanage, knowing this, having plenty of evidence about this. They refused to do anything about it. Their whole system is set up so that they can frame anybody they want to at any time with embezzlement. I mean, they're a very corrupt organization. And, you know, we tried to do a lot. I invite you to go back and watch some of the podcasts that we did close to the beginning of when we started this podcast to expose it. We have Persecuting the Persecuted website that shows it. And lately, you know, and we're very grateful that the Roy's Report has been publishing articles about what's happening at Voice of the Martyrs and the problems there, because there's many problems there. But even in exposing it, I hear some of the people that are talking, especially Jason Peters, and go, yeah, right, because there's real reasons to understand what Voice of the Martyrs typically does when they get into a publicity problem is they find a scapegoat, and they then put everything on them and pretend like everything's fine with the organization. Well, the reality is the organization itself is very corrupt.
Yeah, so, I mean, you mentioned Persecuting the Persecuted. So I think, you know, if you're not familiar with the situation, you know, if you go on persecutingthepersecuted.com, the first video there, if you watch the first 15 minutes of it, it's like a mini documentary that kind of gets you up to speed on, you know, our involvement in it. And then we have a few hours of podcasts that we've done also linked there talking about it. So we're going to try to avoid rehashing all of it on this episode to avoid, if only to avoid having like a 4-hour episode. All right, so these articles that have come out are on, you know, the Roy's Report, which I guess this is Julie Roy's is the founder, I guess, of it, which, you know, we're not asking you to love her and all the reporting that she's done, but I think something that we should do is, if people are speaking truth, even if we don't like all their targets in the past, we should listen to it. You know, so I mean, I don't know everything she's done. I know she became famous for going after MacArthur, but whether you like her or not, this isn't even written by her. But anyway, the first article that came out was Whistleblowers Accuse Voice of the Martyrs President of Deception and Retaliation. And so that's, you know, Cole Richards, who was the president of Voice of the Martyrs. Currently,
still is.
Yeah, currently is the president of Voice of the Martyrs. Now, back a few years ago, you know, we had some contact with Cole Richards before he was the president. Do you want to fill that?
So let me talk about what I know about Cole Richards. Cole Richards has said about 2 sentences to me in his whole life, and they were filled with lies. We went there to expose this, so we made a documentary that had some people. We got better witnesses later, but that were basically saying, you know, there was a lot of molestation that was going on at the Stevens Center, and that Voice of the Martyrs knew about it. And so we take it, and I fly down to Oklahoma to meet with them,
which is VOM headquarters. VOM
headquarters. At that point in time, Cole Richards was the CFO, Jim Dow was the president, and I was supposed to meet with Cole Richards. We get there at the time we were scheduled to get there, and Cole Richards is walking out. And so Cole Richards says, I really wish I could meet with you like I promised, but I can't. I have another engagement that I have to go to, and I can't get out of it. And so he then walks out of the building. We then, because it was a rather long drive, we went into the restroom. When we come out, Cole Richards is standing there. He didn't realize we went into the restroom. He was coming back in the building. It was all fake. It was just, you know, we were meeting with Mark Underwood. When we met with him, there's no question that we were being recorded and broadcast, and Cole Richards just didn't want to be in the room. And so Cole Richards very plainly lied. And Cole Richards, before that, we know that he was aware of the molestation. That was the only time I had interaction with Cole Richards. There were other times that the prostitutes that we went over with, or that I went over with, had interactions with Cole Richards. Cole Richards was the one who set up the accounting system, and he set it up in such a way that it was easy to frame anybody anytime that you want, anybody that's overseas. And so I can explain that. I think we explained it in the video. So what happened is, when we found out about this information, we left, and they had given money to this prostitute that was supposed to then give it to the clinic in Nigeria. But when he finds out that they're stealing money, because we found out stealing money and raping the girls, when he found out that they were stealing money, he brought the money back. And he goes to Voice of the Martyrs and says, here's your, I don't remember what the amount was, maybe $20,000 or something. And they said, we can't take it. It's out. Once it's out, it's off our books. We can't take it back. We have no means to take it back. And basically the person I went, this was Jeff Arnett. Jeff Arnett said, but wait a second, you're telling me I should just keep this money? Yes, that's the only thing you can do. It's like, no, I'm not keeping this money. You can charge me with stealing if I keep this money. No, you can't do it. And Cole Richards stepped in after he argued with a while with this accountant. And Cole Richards said, take the money, because he saw the problem. But he was the one that set up the system that says that they don't take money back. It's all fake.
In these articles, what they're talking about is that he has pushed out his predecessor, Jim Dow, to gain control of the organization, that he lies to protect himself and VOM. They have these 10 former VOM staff. They're whistleblowers who are accusing Cole Richards of this. And, they have all the stuff in the article. A lot of this we don't necessarily have personal knowledge of. But
there is another piece about it that I do have some knowledge, because if you look at the time frame of when Jim Dow gets forced out, and we'll talk about John Camilla later, but you and I were both there, that we went and met with John Camilla. Well, John Camilla,
who was a VOM at that point, the VOM Nigeria person.
VOM had said to Zingac, to our now employee in Nigeria, that he was their representative in Nigeria. So it was official that he was their representative. This has actually been adjudicated in court, because he went, I'm not their representative, and we proved, and the Nigerian government said, yeah, he's the representative of VOM. But so we go to John Camilla as the representative of VOM and say, VOM has made promises that they will fund the lawsuits of these girls. If they come and go to court, that they'll fund the lawsuit. So we stood in front of Camilla and said, fine, we'll give you the legal bills. I think our church paid something like $140,000, maybe more, of legal fees to deal with this. And VOM had press releases and said that they would cover it. Total lie. So we pushed Camilla on that issue, and that was a month before Jim Dow was forced to resign. Well, Jim Dow was the one that made that promise. So my guess is that he was supposed to retire 2 years later, but Cole Richards and the machinations in VOM uses this escalating scandal to basically force out Jim Dow, would be my expectation, because it's basically a board of directors meeting later that he gets forced out.
It was wrong for him to make the promise that VOM would actually pay for these girls.
Well, no, they weren't willing to pay for these girls,
right,
because it would just hurt them.
Right.
Because these girls could testify that they knew about it.
Right, that's what I mean.
Especially,
This would have harmed VOM. This is a bad thing for VOM to do for VOM.
But so they then turn around, right, and they force Jim Dow out, and then they turn around and they say, well, that story that Reformation Baptist Church is putting out, that story about that exposure, that was the old guard. We've now cleaned house. That was the force, is that they said, we've now cleaned house. Well, no, Cole Richards was the one that was overseeing Jason Peters, who was the one that was actually overseeing what was going on and knew everything that was going on. Cole Richards, we know, knew everything that was going on, but yet there was no cleaning house. It was just they chose Jim Dow to be the scapegoat so that they could say they cleaned house when they didn't clean house at all. The people who were actively on a daily basis doing it were the people who remained.
And a lot of what the Roy's Report whistleblowers are concerned about is like tyrannical stuff against the VOM USA staff, which, is very easy to believe that, he would do things like that. And they talk about something that we talked about in some of our other videos of how they use pseudonyms and things like that. Also, concerning. But I think that there's kind of this failure to really address some of, the things that I think God would take more seriously, which is where you're not just abusing Americans, but on a global sense, rich Americans. Even the poor VOM employees They're rich Americans, compared to everyone in the world. But, what about the oppression of people in other countries? What about the stuff that they did in Africa and where they made promises to fund the people that were abused using their money and that they allowed to continue when they knew about it? What about that? And it seems like there's not the same concern about it. And so, we mentioned Jason Peters. And
can I add one other thing to that as you say that? And then as you look at these whistleblowers, what's the unemployment rate in the United States? 3% or something like that. Any of those whistleblowers can leave Voice of the Martyrs and probably not have any trouble getting another job.
I think most of them have, if not all of them.
Right. And so they're going, oh, look at how we were abused. Well, they have the choice to leave. You look at how they're abusing people, the way they're abusing people in Nigeria. Nigeria has like a 28% unemployment rate. And among the youth, it's like 60%. So if you have a 25-year-old in Nigeria, they're really trapped. And then you have orphanage where they're 12-year-old or 8 years old. They don't have a choice. So these whistleblowers are going, oh, poor us. When look at who they're abusing. They're abusing far weaker people. And as you said, Joshua, you think which one God says? Read Isaiah. Isaiah says, you didn't defend the fatherless. These whistleblowers weren't defending the fatherless. Who cares that they were abused? They deserve the abuse.
I mean, and after we brought the what was going on in the orphanage to Voice of the Martyrs, they continued funding Isaac. They continued supporting him. They gave him supplies. They gave him resources. During which time he was hiring people to threaten the girls. I mean, I remember how often we got stories about how they were being threatened at their work. They were being, their family was being contacted. There were people, there were all these things that were going on. And Voice of the Martyrs US is continuing to support him. I mean, not even were they not helping the girls, they were actively helping the rapist.
And that was, they pretend like, because it had been a few years already that they knew about him raping.
Right.
Multiple people had come forward, multiple people, in the way they structured the investigation. They notify everybody ahead of time. They have the sister of the person that's being accused as the one that's shepherding the girls to it. I mean, it was just horrible what they were doing, just absolutely horrible. And they knew about it for years before we found out about it and exposed it anymore. It's only when it got exposed in the American press that they did anything. Until then, it's just Nigerians being raped. Who cares? Was their attitude.
Give money. We'll wash our hands. We'll hand resources to the guy who's
hundreds of thousands of dollars,
and we'll just leave and we'll just withdraw.
Right.
And when we're saying we and we're saying whistleblowers, I mean, we don't know all the whistleblowers. So we're talking specifically about one guy, Jason Peters, who we'll talk about in a minute. But the other ones, I mean, I think if we were sitting down with them, we'd have, well, first of all, some of them were bringing up issues from other countries where they were saying, we think people in other countries are being treated badly. So that, we would say that's a good thing to bring up for sure. I mean, I think if we were sitting them we'd have real questions as to what was going on. And why, when you hear about what happened in Nigeria, why are you still working there? But that's a lot different than the guy who's one of the articles is about, Jason Peters. So I mean, and he even came out with his video where he even says it's like an apology video. Here's why I really left VOM, which I think he should make an apology video. I didn't feel like it really was an apology video. I think it was an apology video saying, I'm sorry Cole Richards was so bad to his staff, which, okay, fine. I don't think he should be bad to his staff either. But Jason Peters knew about people from Nigeria reported him what was going on in the orphanage there. And actually, when we met him, he was like me personally, he's the only VOM person I ever met. And one of the first things he told us, because he knew we were going to go to this orphanage, this orphanage is not up to VOM standards. We're trying to clean it up. So we already knew about the molestation, and then he's giving us this kind of generic warning of watch out.
Yeah,
but that's not what he's apologizing for. And he says, well, the reason I really left is because, this guy that I brought in and they promised they were going to promote him and they didn't promote him. And that's, you're concerned about your protege not being promoted, but you're not going to resign over the fact that they were covering up molestation and you were reporting on it. And even like, let's imagine he was, handling it properly and they didn't listen to him, but you're not going to resign over that. Like, your apology has nothing to do with what you need to be apologizing for.
So let me say, the first time I met Jason Peters, it was right before I preached at Reverend Sambo's church, which was a Assemblies of God church. And there's some Assemblies of God churches. This isn't a generic statement, but it was a horrible church. They worship money. Literally, they were the singer was doing dances and they were stuffing money into his clothing. Is how he was raising money. And so I went up there and preached, and I preached on you can't serve God and mammon. And clearly you're serving mammon. You don't serve God. You pretend like you're Christians. You're not, was basically my message. And Jason Peters, I was watching him while they were doing this thing, and he was just celebrating and was just rejoicing, where you have this absolute perversion of the gospel. So here's somebody who has, at best, zero discernment about what it means to be a person of God. So that's the first thing I want to say. When Jason Peters going, oh, I'm so serious about God, don't believe it. Don't believe it at all. This is not the Jason Peters I know. But Jason Peters then afterwards, he knew that we were going to the Stevens Center,
which is the orphanage.
Because Voice of the Martyrs was forcing us to. They basically said, you got your visa by saying that you were associated with us. Joss had a facility. There was no reason to go to Stevens Center, but they forced us to go to the Stevens Center. And so we went to the Stevens Center. And so then that's when Jason comes up to me and goes, we suspect things going on there. Keep your eyes out and let me know if you find anything. Now, at the time, it seemed really weird because I already had really serious questions about him. He wasn't with us most of the time. He was doing a widows conference at the time that he was leading. But as we're leaving, that's what he says to me. And then we fly and we go to Abeokuta, where the Stevens Center is. And we get to the Stevens Center, and there's nobody to meet us. And the guy who finally comes out, he goes, this has never happened before. Whites never come here unless Isaac Newton's here. But all of a sudden, Isaac Newton got a call from somebody this morning and said, I have to leave. And he left. Well, I suspect Jason Peters called him. Jason Peters. I thought it at the time, and I think it now. And so that they basically were trying to cut off our ability to see anything, our ability to talk to Isaac, our ability to, because let's be serious, you're in a church with 1,000 people, and I call them all unbelievers. I don't think Jason Peters thought that I would be soft-spoken and go, oh, Isaac, aren't you wonderful? And
let's be honest. We have other people who, when they got shuttled through there, they were put in positions where he's
sitting in basically, yes, short shorts without anything else on, with teenage girls with very little clothing surrounding, and he's like, Jeff, come sit here with me. Right. So
it's
that's
a place
what
where
Isaac
you could go to be compromised very often. I mean, they could. It
was set up to compromise people.
Right.
And so, but in this case,
Jason saw you and went, this guy's not going to.
Anyway, so my experience with Jason Peters, and I didn't know this at the time, that he had already had this reported multiple times before. And so, in the summer of 2015, there's a man that comes over and goes to Oklahoma to be trained to be a prosthetist. And he goes with Jeff Arnett, and he meets with Jason Peters. And Raphael goes, I know of all these girls that have been molested. And Jason Peters goes, it's not Isaac Newton. Like, how ridiculous is that? Raphael was the accountant for the non-VOM side, right? Because basically he opened it up to the public so that there's other students could pay money to go there, which is part of the reason that it was so overcrowded, is because Isaac was making money on the side, and that's what Raphael was. He was the accountant there. But he talked to Isaac every day. He knew these girls were talking about Isaac. I mean, and Jason Peters' answer is, no, it couldn't be Isaac. Well, you have this perfect witness. And you also find out that he knew he had been reported in a letter. He had reported another time. This was the third time that he was told.
They knew his office had a doorway entering into the girls' dorms.
Right.
Right? You know?
Duh, that doesn't look suspicious. And his sister was in charge of the girls' dorm. Wow, that looks really innocent. And so all these things that they investigated, let's make sure we recognize it was Jason Peters that did that. When I saw that video today, I looked at Jason Peters' video and I went, oh, this is his CV. He's trying to be the next president of Voice of the Martyrs. He's trying to go, oh, look, we need to clean up and this is what we need to do. Jason Peters, I have no doubt that he'd throw Cole Richards under the bus without hesitation. But at the same time, Jason Peters is as guilty as Cole Richards. Granted, he was the underling, but he was as guilty. He was the frontline person. He was the one who knew about this. He was the one that was covering it up. He is not innocent in any way, shape, or form.
And if you wonder why anybody would care about wanting to be the president of VOM, it's because if you read some of this stuff, I mean, last year they had a $100 million budget. And so, I mean, this is something where, I mean, this organization has a ton of money. Of course, somebody would want to be in charge of that amount of money. And, I mean, people just stop giving to VOM. Can we just say that in the middle of this? Stop giving to VOM. Don't give them another penny. They're not using it for God's work.
So let me read this section from one of the articles on kind of their response to the video that we put out. Nick Gray, former Deputy Regional Director for South Asia, said Richards pushed talking points that blamed the leadership in Nigeria, said VOM's hands were clean, but in a way that showed no compassion for victims. Dan Horn was painted as the evil one, Isaac as the predator, and Cole as the savior, Gray said. Both Peters and Patton said the only reason VOM cut off funding to the Stevens Center was because of public exposure in 2016-2017 due to Horn's advocacy. What happened during those 2+ years when VOM knew there were serious issues, Peters said. Only God knows. Well, that's a bit of an issue because it's not actually true that only God knows, because some people, when they heard about this, went and investigated it. So some people knew what was going on for those 2 years, because we who had nothing really to do with it, heard about it, and were concerned and realized nothing was happening, so we went and figured it out. Jason Peters, who was responsible for it, did not know what was going on because he did not go find out. Yes, he claims that only God knows, when there are other people who know. And
wait a second. He knew, and he knew for 5 years, not 2 years. He's simply lying in that statement. VOM knew years before. Jason Peters in particular knew for years before and did nothing. So for him to pretend like, oh yeah, only God knows. Yeah, because you kept being told and you kept covering it up and you kept letting little girls be raped. There's no question that in the sight of God, Jason Peters is a rapist.
I mean, because in the middle of all this, you guys were offering them. I mean, you basically, we're bringing it to. I mean, I remember when some of this was first happening. You know, I get a call from you, set up an FTP server, we got to upload stuff. We make our first call to their board of directors. They're like, oh, this seems really troubling. And I remember
that was after like 6 months when
right.
we thought Jim Dow would actually do something.
We have real hope, and we're excited, you know. And then we realize they're not going to do much. So then you go back and you get more information.
Well, no, then we found out. Right, Don Banner was his brother-in-law, who was the one from the board, and he's covering up for Jim Dow because he's Peggy Dow's sister, Peggy Dow's brother. And I mean, it's all this garbage. But what VOM does is they find scapegoats, and Jim Dow was a scapegoat. And now things are coming out, and there's other things that are coming out at the same time that looks like it hasn't made the news yet. But there was a man named John Camilla. Now, John Camilla, when this stuff was going on, John Camilla was being hired. Now, John Camilla was being hired to be the Isaac replacement in Nigeria. Only he's being American, so it would be nice and squeaky clean. The problem is that John Camilla was forced out, according to ECWA. ECWA is the Evangelical Church of West Africa, is what it was originally called. It's the denomination that's a reformed denomination in Nigeria, as reformed as you get in Nigeria. But I talked to their chief counsel, and their chief counsel was trying to get John Camilla arrested for embezzlement of funds when he fled the country. Voice of the Martyrs knew about that, and they hired him to be their representative in Nigeria. Who do you think hired him?
Jason Peters?
And Cole Richards. These are the people that are appointing him, and and they know this stuff. They knew he was a crook. Why do you hire a crook for that position? Because you're so honest and upstanding? Or is it because you're criminals and you want a criminal in that position? This is what they did. And just to fill out this story, John Camilla was fired like 3 months ago, something like that. He was fired because a man named Judge Saul was starting to expose what Camilla was doing. Because what Camilla was doing is he reset up, not with the rape, but especially with the money, he's reset up everything that Isaac did. Well, they knew that he was going to do that because they set him up to do that. And so he's, here's a bag of rice to give to the widows, and you take 90% of the rice and you give 10%, and then you go sell 90% on the black market. He was doing exactly what Isaac did. And it was set up to do that. That's what Voice of the Martyrs does, at least in Nigeria. I don't know in other countries, but that's what they do in Nigeria. And so Camilla, when that started to get exposed, they used Camilla as a scapegoat. I think they're expecting greater exposure of that. So now they're setting up Cole Richards to be a scapegoat.
And I mean, you said not with the sexual issues, but I mean, his wife. I was just reading his wife.
I can't prove the sexual issues.
Right, because his wife runs like some sort of house in Nigeria for sex abuse survivors. You really want the person who, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, who had no interest in keeping the promise to the people who were survivors from VOM. And you want him / his wife to be running this house for abuse survivors?
Did you know he's right? And I hear some of the stories with Camilla. I mean, we only met with Camilla once, and he was very he raised all kinds of questions to me. I mean, just meeting with him, it was very obvious that he was not somebody that any Christian would ever deal with. That was very obvious from the start. But but they knew about it. They knew about all these things. They knew that he had to flee the country, and but that didn't stop them. And like you said, I mean, they knew that his wife was running this missionary to sexual abuse victims. Well, as soon as I hear that, I've had enough experience in this world, that always raises questions with me. Because unless you have that set up very carefully, it is a way to recruit sexual abuse victims in many cases. And you have to set that up with great protections, and they had zero protection. He was in control. She was in control. There was no protection for the girls there.
Which city was that in?
Jos.
As in Jos.
So it wasn't set up it wasn't set up the same way the Stevens Center was, where the girls were taken out of their natural language environment, so they couldn't speak to anybody, so that they were cut off. But it was still very suspicious.
So I know we've been going through a lot of court cases over the last 6 to 8 years with VOM. What's the most recent update, or what court cases are still ongoing at this point?
The most significant one is we finally got the court is supposed to render a verdict soon on VOM, and not VOCM. VOCM was Voice of the Martyrs, Voice of Christian Martyrs, because Voice of the Martyrs in a Muslim country, they think that means Muslim martyrs. So the Nigerian branch is called VOCM, and the U.S. branch is VOM. There's a lawsuit against both of them about wrongful termination, because basically they set up Zingac so that he would be fired for embezzlement. And Camilla was the one who was the representative. And so when we went to court on that court case, the court basically adjudicated that and said, giving notice to Camilla, that you had ample proof that he was VOM's representative in Africa or in Nigeria. And so because he was their representative, he's been the one that's defending them, or not defending them, but he was the one that showed up at first. But then Voice of the Martyrs started to show up directly, and they had their own attorney. But at the same time, he is the point of contact, if you will. And now all of a sudden he gets fired right before the verdict comes out, which is also suspicious. But we have good reason to hope and to believe that finally the Nigerian courts, after 8 years of pursuing this, the Nigerian courts will actually find what is obviously against the law. Now, in Nigerian court systems, it's not that hard to bribe. We don't bribe, obviously, but Voice of Martyrs, I have no doubt that they would bribe without any hesitation whatsoever. They are a very filthy organization. And so they might try to bribe the judge. Hopefully that won't happen and we'll get a just verdict.
So is Camillus still in Nigeria?
I don't believe so. When I heard that he was fired, he had been fired that week.
Okay.
But again, Voice of the Martyrs isn't going, yeah, we set this up so that we can steal money. They said, oh, Camilla, what a shocking. And they drove to say, oh, we're so sorry this happened. And they just set up John Camilla as a scapegoat. Right. And I'm sure that just like Jason Peters, just like Cole Richards, just like Jim Dow, they'll hand them a bunch of money because they're a scapegoat. But it doesn't mean Voice of the Martyrs won't pay them to be a scapegoat. They'll be forced to get money without the power.
So VOM in these articles, these former VOM employees are saying we need to clean house. So what would that look like if that actually happened, and if it wasn't just different people wanting to get rid of the person driving the wagon or wanting to drive the wagon? I mean, what if they actually wanted to clean things up?
Right now, I don't think they have any handle on who is actually a Christian martyr. I don't think they have any idea whatsoever. And so how do you clean a house on an organization that's supposed to be dealing with Christian martyrs when I think we even did a podcast on this about their definition of a Christian is not a Christian martyr is not what most people would consider a definition of a Christian martyr. And so part of it is their organization. It was founded with a very ecumenical approach, right? Wurmbrand was in a prison, I think, in Romania. He was with a Roman Catholic and a Mormon and a this and that, and they all went, oh, we believe in the same God. Voice of Martyrs was originally founded much more to be an anti-communist organization than an actual Christian organization. And so they'd have to, if you really wanted to clean house, for the reason that people are giving money to Voice of the Martyrs, you really have to start by what does it mean to be a Christian? And I don't think Voice of the Martyrs has a good sound foundation of that. And until then, they're basically selling a false bill of goods.
And I think if VOM or even some of the people involved wanted to really, deal with they can't really clean house in any way without dealing with the history of what went on. And some of that is because the people that are involved in the leadership are still the same people. And some of it is because as an organization, they have a responsibility to deal with the stuff that happened not just a few years ago, where, they had so much corruption to the highest levels, even in this one, Nigerian incident, that they really need to bring in outside people. And this is kind of what our original request was, bring in outside people to do an honest look at what did they know, who knew what, when did they know it, release a public report, deal with it, fire the people you need to fire. You made promises to people in Nigeria. You had victims in Nigeria, where there should be some restitution for that. To actually, that's just the minimum of how to deal with these things correctly. Is you need to be honest, you need to be public, and you look at organizations that have had these issues, and you see some of them have done a much better job than others. Plenty of them have done not a full job, but they've done a much better job, where they haven't just released a statement saying it's not our fault and then done and made promises they didn't keep. Some of them did a report and released the report, and we can disagree with things about the report, but that's a step in the right direction, and that's a step that they have not been willing to take. And how about, if you're calling for cleaning house, call for some honesty about what went on in the past.
And related to that too is it's not like, I still know of victims. I still know of people that are suffering, and I'm not sure how you could fix it, but I do know that not doing anything and caring for any of the people that were abused and damaged, because there's a lot of them that have been really abused and really damaged by it. And just the false gospel that's been preached, they need to fix that. That's caused so much damage that, you have all these people that graduated from the Stevens Center thinking that they know who God was, and they have no idea because he's the VOM God, and that has nothing to do with the biblical God. And so it goes a lot broader. Part of it is not just saying, okay, let's expose, but it's also saying, Let's make amends for the damage that we did, because we destroyed a lot of lives, and they destroyed a lot of lives. All they cared about, because one of the titles was all they care about is the appearance. So they do this press release where they say, we'll help any victim. Total lie. Absolutely total lie. But yet it was all about their public appearance. It wasn't actually about caring about the people. And so they need to fundamentally change to actually care about the people. Right now they love money.
And one of the episodes that we did, a few years ago was, our nonprofit scriptural, kind of centered around this VOM, issue, but kind of looking at it, is there root issues with how they're set up from the very foundation? And I don't know.
Like parachurch organizations, right?
So should parachurch organizations be set up to minister to people in foreign countries? And I not to rehash everything about it, but I think a big part of this is fundamentally usurping something that should be done through the church and saying we're going to have the churches just write a check, and now we feel good, we've done our foreign mission, sent it to VOM, and everything is going to be fixed. And I think fundamentally that's an issue. That said, they could make huge steps in positive directions without shutting down. But I think when we come down to it, we'd be happiest if they just shut down, because they're doing more harm than good.
And the reality is that it is so complicated, right? I mean, we try to do this, right? We've got a prosthetic ministry over there. We do pastors' conferences. We do all kinds of stuff. Over in Nigeria, we do widows things, on and on, whatever. But you look at that, and to hold accountability on that is really difficult, because you have, for instance, in Nigeria, the exchange rate went from like 1,100 in December, November to 1,800, and now it's at 1,350 or something like that. And so you have these wild swings. So money, it's like I do reports to the church, and how does the church even know what it means? Because the numbers are like all over the place. But in a church, you have real accountability. When you do this, like ECFA basically goes, if it crosses the water's edge, we can't do anything about it. We can't track it. We can't do anything about it. So basically, all these organizations that are doing these foreign mission work, you just have to understand that you must trust the people, because it cannot be held accountable. It's way too hard. It's way too difficult. You can try. There's ways you can do it in a small scale, but in a large scale like VOM, I just don't think it's possible. And so you can't have an organization like ECFA come in and do it. It's just not doable. And now ECFA has its own problems, right? So you shouldn't look and say, oh, the account of ECFA, that's somehow going to do accountability. No, don't believe that they'll do accountability on things like this. It's just not true.
When we were trying to deal with VOM, we saw they were a member of ECFA, which is, Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. So we email them and say, we have knowledge of what happened in...
We have evidence.
And they said, we've already heard about it.
We've heard these rumors.
Right.
Yeah, take it up with them.
Investigate it. I think they said, well, I think in one of the other podcasts we quote it. Maybe we'll put it on the screen here. But basically, they just said, we already know about this. We don't need to look into it. We not going to even ask for the evidence, which is telling you that they are a scam, because they did not have the evidence, because this is stuff that we went to Nigeria and talked to people and got evidence.
And we had bank records. We had like real evidence, right? I mean, it wasn't fake evidence. It was real evidence about how they had modified checks, it was real evidence, and they didn't care.
Right. And it's a bad scam, because a good scam would be, send me the evidence, you do a quote unquote investigation and find out that, and then announce that everything has been cleared. They're a bad scam. They don't even ask for the evidence.
But what they are is they're a threatening organization. They can basically put people out of business if they want to. So it's a muscle organization.
If ECFA says that you're not a good a good company, then people will stop giving. This is the issue is, if we want to stop people from giving to VOM, we can sit here and we can tell you these things, and people will go, but who else am I going to give to? ECFA comes out and says, don't give to this organization. People will stop giving to the organization. And
they do that arbitrarily just to flex their muscles. They can shut people down that are actually doing good work, because They like to do that. That's how they show that you better kowtow to us.
Right.
There's corrupt. That's why it's easy to believe, and I'm pretty sure that's true, that Cole Richards used to be their CFO. Of course he would be. This is the kind of person that ECFA hires.
I mean, one of the other things, like Joshua was saying, the best thing for VOM would be to shut down. You should not expect that VOM is going to shut down. I mean,
they'll find scapegoat after scapegoat. This is their pattern.
Right.
This has been their pattern for years. They were trying to make, who knows about it? Jim Dow knows about it. Cole Richards knows about it. Jason Peters knows about it. But they go. Peter Jasek knew about it. He very clearly knew about it. Right. All these people know about it, but they go, it's all Isaac. They make scapegoats so that people don't actually investigate. And watching Jason Peters make a scapegoat of Cole Richards, it's like, give me a break. When I told Zingac that Jason Peters was turning on Cole Richards, he's like, these two were as close as any two people could possibly be. They were conspiring together to cause little girls to be raped. And now all of a sudden Jason Peters cares? Right. Really? People should be realistic.
It's a power struggle between evil men over money.
Yeah.
I mean,
power and position and everything else, yeah.
But I mean, and I think that's part of it is when you ask yourself, should you ever give money to VOM? I mean, think about the things we've talked about. Over 8 years, you've had Jim Dow was running things, was handling things. You've had Cole Richards and Jason Peters. They're hiring this guy who's embezzling. I mean, organizations, they build up practices, they build up procedures. Look at the level at what these things have been done. Look at how long they've been done. Like I said, this was going on before. There was a guy who killed himself who was the president, and they said what was going on there was even worse than we can tell you. I mean, this is
right.
The history
they had to move
VOM.
the body so that because otherwise worse things would be exposed. I mean, that's what somebody who works there told us. I mean, this is absurd.
Right. You cannot just come in and put new people to start running things. You would have to rip everything up all throughout the entire organization, because if you're hiring people to embezzle, that's your practice. That's what you do. So, I mean, this is just, understand, the best thing to do is for the people of God to look and go, we're never going to give another penny to them. If your pastor is supporting them, go to your pastor and go, why are you supporting people who do this? Why are we even thinking about doing this?
If you run into someone on the street, say the same thing to them.
But even more basic, if you know your pastor supporting him, you should go, is this a church? Or does the pastor not care about the gospel? Because they preach a false gospel. I mean, what we've done, we talk about the things that we've done. What I've done the most, time-wise, over in Nigeria, is try to get people to understand that there is a true gospel and there are all kinds of false gospels. What Voice of the Martyrs does is say every gospel's true. As long as it has JESUSCHRIST, it is salvific. That's evil. That's completely contrary to what Christ said. So when you give money to Voice of the Martyrs, understand what you're doing. You're propagating a false gospel that is sending people to hell because you're telling them they're Christians when they're not. What could be more evil than that? How can you give money to an organization that's actively proselytizing a false gospel?
As bad as the molestation and rape of young girls is, the perversion of the gospel is worse. And so if your stomach is turned by what they did to these girls, understand that the problem is the church isn't upset by the fact that before they did that, they didn't care what the gospel meant. At one point, I thought, well, maybe it's just isolated to certain areas. And now that I realize that the people who were in charge have moved up the next level, there's no reason to believe that VOM is good anywhere. It's just maybe there's an area where somebody's helping someone because they haven't been able to hire somebody who's willing to embezzle there yet. You know what I mean? But there's no reason to expect that VOM does actual good.
We've been fighting the battle against Voice of the Martyrs for 8 years. We pray that others join us. We're very thankful for the Roy's report that they're exposing these things. But a lot more exposure needs to happen. But that will only happen when churches care. When they actually care about the gospel. When they actually care about how their money's used, whether it's building the kingdom of God or whether it's building the kingdom of men. Make sure you're working to build the kingdom of God. God pours out his wrath on those who blaspheme his name. Thanks for joining us.